Section 3 of The Dark Chamber by Leonard Klein. Slibbervox recording is in the public domain. Part 2, Miriam. Chapter 17. Now Helion leaned her arm on the couch of the morning and lifted her gold brow from the pillow of blue and smiled. And Helion said, I am fulfilled which am that alas which is the eye and the hand, and that elemus which is the ear and the mouth, and vision is upon me. For I see the worlds that are of myself caught up in the hair of the winds, and the empurpled waters that are of myself coiling upon the yellow shores of the lands, and the green lands that are of myself cradling the waters. The winds that are my breath I hear, how they envelop the lands and the waters in my breath, and the men that are of myself lift their eyes to the white winds, and tree and flower and beast and bird, how they inhale my breath and give it forth in song and color. Themselves myself all things and purposes, and I within their spirit, and I without their comfort and delight, exuberance and lustihood, the flame of the flame, the mingling from everlasting to everlasting. But out of the heart of Helion murmured the voice of Elas, which is seeing and touching, and Elas wondered and said, I have regarded the turning worlds, and tossed them in my hands aside, not understanding. How can it be that now I understand? And out of the heart of Helion murmured the voice of Elemus, which is hearing and saying. And Elemus said, I have listened to sough of wind and wash of water, and I have scorned them, doubting, but they were perjured, not understanding. How can it be that now I understand? Then Helion gathered into her glowing bosom the mists and the stars, and into her bosom of flame the noons and the nights, and into her hands the years and the seasons, and fashioned them into the face which is her face. And Helion looked down from the couch of the morning and smiled. And Helion said, The eye saw falsehood, the mouth uttered only mirage, the hand that could not see groped in vanity, and the ear that could not sing shrank from the song. But in the mingling which is forever they are resolved, which were Elas and Elemus, water in water and fire in fire, dark with darkness and light with light tide, assumed and absorbed utterly, mingled beyond the wrath of the Sunderer. Into the body of Elemus the body of Elas, and the body of Elas given into the body of Elemus. And these twain are no longer in loneliness, but I remain which am that mingling, the flame of the flame, forever burning, until I be consumed, and the foot of the slaker tread my ashes, and his foot stamp out the embers of my eternity. Therefore the eye in my brow sees truth in scarlet, and blue and gold, which none can see save me. And the tongue in my mouth tells beauty made song, which none save me can sing. Behold, I am Helion. Chapter 18. Letting myself in late from a pastel night. The chalk snow and the lead sky and the rye sienna of stricken trees, without the faintest star's point of life. I saw her go along the balcony, white negligee held close around her throat. She carried a thin, flickering taper that threw gigantic shadows of balustrade and post, jerking in ponderous countermarch across the tiled pavement of the hall. Her feet, hid in a haze of silks, made no sound, and in a minute she was gone, and the hall was dark, and my heart had quite ceased beating, for she had entered my room. How many days since I was alone with her, or found opportunity for more than casual formalities of speech? She no longer even mentioned our music. She played and strolled and chatted now with the Spaniard, and when, on an urgent summons, he went grumbling off to the study of Richard Pride, she fled me obviously, withdrew to her room or to some hiding place where my sick imagination mocked me. She made a tryst with Del Prado. All this time I had sought her. With desire, perhaps, I do not know. Over and over again I would change the manner of words with which I planned to greet her. Perhaps desire, but now tonight the moon was in my veins. I pressed back against the door until the bolt caught, and the snap pricked and focalized my thought, and fairly running I hurried across the hall and up the stairs. Very quietly I opened my door and stepped into my room. Janet was sitting at my desk. Janet was sitting at my desk, with the candle still in her hand, but her eyes on my manuscript where it lay spread. She did not look up at my entrance. She did not hear me come in, and I waited abashed by her loveliness. The black hair billowing over her shoulders from the marble shore of her brow, eddying around her full throat, the delicate swelling of her breasts, and the curve of her slim leg into rounded knee, all draped and adorned and not in the least concealed by the silk of her nightgown. Presently she turned the page, and I knew she had come to the end of that passage. It was clear in my mind as on the paper. It would have told her what was in my mind to say, and I felt all of me pleading toward her, and it was the earnestness of my gaze that aroused her at length. She glanced around swiftly, startled, and drew the careless folds of her gown more closely about her, and made as if to rise. "Janet!" I walked over to the table and moved a chair up so that, sitting there, I could study her eyes. "How beautiful you are. I've been seeking you so long to tell you that, and here at last you are, and you are beautiful. It was good of you to come." She appeared to be collecting herself like a sleepwalker jogged awake. "The coincidence was fortunate, you might better say. My dear Oscar, I can't recognize any act of goodness that prompted me to slip in here. I wanted to for my own selfish reasons. You, for your own selfish reasons, wanted me to come. Therefore, I'm good." "That may be one way of putting it," I agreed slowly, taken aback and yet so enchanted by her venosity, intimate and appetent. "But I think you are good. I've seen you with music and watched it cling about you. Beauty abhors ugliness, and it loves you. Melodies hover in your hair like sunlight, lie across your bosom like flowers." Her fingers fretted on the table. "What a queer man you are." She nodded toward my manuscript with a twitch of I know not what malice on her mouth. "Like your friend there. Was I wrong to read his stuff? I presume to the popping end he protested that his lady was good. She must have been. Good to make love to." Janet smiled. "Yet I dare say it makes fine music." It was a dream, but if a man can dwell with such a dream, I imagine the little duration of it is enough more than to compensate for the disillusion. Don't you understand? Oscar, I must tell you that it's joy enough to live for a year under the very wings of an ideal. Better than live 80, a bleak, bald, grubbing, incredulous life. Beneath your glib cynicism and your show of sophistication, you know that. All men know it, and if they don't admit it, they admit at least their own frustration. Oscar. But I flung on without giving her leave, putting my hand on hers and seizing her attention with my gaze. "Do you remember our driving that first time to town? You disconcerted me, Janet, with your candor and impetuousness. I was too dull and heavy to fly with you. But I loved you then, and I have loved you more and more every day since. While we were at the piano, while we were exploring the hills and the cliffs, I would tell myself that I could not love anyone. I was afraid, you see, to yield myself to such joy, lest it interrupt my work, scatter my strength. That was the artist in me reacting, for the artist thinks always first of his work and of other people, lovers and friends, only when they become so much to him that his work can't continue without them." I lifted her hand, cool but unresisting, to my lips and leaned toward her. "And you have become so much to me that my work can't continue without you, Janet. You are a melody. You stand in the midst of my weaving melodies. They are the curve of your body and the profile of your spirit. They are scarves that droop from your shoulders and girdles that bind your waist and the snood for your hair. I have written you into my music, Janet, beloved. Helion is you. Believe me, your name spells it. I have found the song in your name and put it down. And horn and clarinet and violin and trumpet will tell your name only that. Let me show you." She stiffened as I bent over her. "Oscar, sit down, please. You annoy me tonight. Really, I must warn you that when I broke in here, I had no expectation of seeing you, and no desire to see you. I like to pry. I happened to be passing your door, and the impulse seized me, knowing you were away, to see what was behind it." Her hardness crushed out my burning. There was such deliberation and intention in her manner. "Janet, you've always acted on impulse. Sneer at yourself if you please, but grant me that this impulse may have been a generous and a cordial one, and that we can make it good." She shook her head, manifestly getting better control of herself now. "Unfortunately, it was not generous or in any way cordial." "It was coincidence, but let's understand that not the coincidence itself, but the uses to which we put it, may make the whole episode lyric. I love you." "We've arrived, it would appear, at a fairly true There's an Athanael denouement, she laughed. Oh, Athanael, I can't say you have made a nun of me, but you did succeed in making me respect the monk in you. Now the monk grovels and is no longer worthy of respect. Please don't touch me. Please! Dismayed, I fell back from her, but I was quite desperate. She looked once more at my manuscript and let her fingers draw across the smooth paper, with a gesture that impressed me as not merely contemptuous. Her negligee she brought once more close about her throat, with a frown puzzling, and finally she took her candle and stood up. Now she met my gaze evenly, and her eyes were not unkindly. "Oscar," she said, "I must not keep you any longer. I didn't intend to come here. I was going elsewhere, and I must hurry. But once you said you would be terrified to have me go, and I stayed. Do you remember, Janet? You dreamed of Beethoven playing, and you half woke and thought still you could hear him. I never told you. I was planning to leave that morning." For a minute, obviously, she did not recall the incident. Then her eyes widened. "No, you don't mean that. Oscar, I'm sorry." "And now it is quite true that if you go at once I shall be desolate. I don't ask you to stay long or suffer anything. Only a few minutes, only until I'm convinced you really are going, for I can't believe it now so readily. Wait 5 minutes, by the clock, Janet. Just 5 minutes. I won't even talk to you, but just look at you. Talk to myself and look at you." She almost yielded then, but she had fastened her heart against me. "You make me hurt you. Why can't you see? I was going tonight to Ramon. No doubt he's still waiting, and I mustn't try his patience too far." As she passed me, I think I put my hands out toward her, but my fingers were flaccid as she brushed by them. Not a word could I find for my hurt or her harshness, and in silence and without the briefest glance over her shoulder, she stepped out of my room into the hall and pulled the heavy door noiselessly shut behind her. Alone I remained, in darkness now, for I had not lighted another candle. Eternally, and in my breast, the shamed and jealous blood ran all one scream. But I would break in on that cruel tryst and stamp the sallow face of Del Prado into the stone of his hearth, kill him in my hands. I went reeling through the darkness of my room, filled with the frenzy of my purpose. I hurled through the darkness, tripping over a chair and picking myself up with an oath. My hands found the doorknob. To the right lay the Spaniard's chamber. The corridor was a pocket of night into which I plunged, but a presentiment halted me, and I wheeled abruptly. That way lay Janet's room, and beyond the balcony, far down the hall, I saw her, a pale figure of moonlight in the streaming drapes, the candle in her hand fluttering and nearly extinguished in her haste, hurrying, gliding swiftly over the thick carpet. When she had vanished behind her door, I turned wearily toward my own, and fell across my bed, and lay an hour between weeping and song. Chapter 19. December invested us by north and west winds that harried us with snow and pelted us with hail. Where all day long it would rain, and then with night mists would surround us, eddying with phantasmal shapes and mournful with the dank, unceasing drip of water. And in the morning Mordaunt's hall would be a hill of ice that flashed in a cold sun. Manic was the year's end, and an addled tale of days she counted off with her slow fingers. And we of that lurking household went spellbound about our business, with little more than comments on the change of weather and the earliness of winter, with much puzzling and introspection nevertheless, and with the foreboding of catastrophe heavy upon us. Like the gradual metamorphosis of organic structure, there had come about imperceptibly a new alignment of forces at Mordaunt's hall, to what causes I could not imagine, and it left me the more bewildered and suspicious. Janet I seldom saw. Del Prado would pass me with a curt nod, but more than once I observed him companioning with Huff, whose behavior now was quite distracted, his tension venting itself in nervous, shrill laughter. Del Prado was much with pride, so that I myself would get 2 or 3 days at a time without being summoned to the study. And yet I became convinced that a keen antipathy was developing between them. I could discern it in Del Prado's almost undissembled sharpness when we were together, rather than any betraying expression on the asbestos-white visage of pride. Then I would recall Huff's plotting, and I would be tempted anew to tell Richard Pride about it, forewarn him against his secretary, but that would so involve us all, and indeed at the bottom I had no great fear of either Huff or the Spaniard. Finally, I saw in Miriam's new attitude reassurance that Huff's conspiring would come to nothing, for her friendliness toward him ostensibly was over. And quite inexplicably, Miriam now became my companion.
"Why don't you ever play for me, Oscar?" she said one evening. "I won't ask you to play jazz."
3 of us had sat down for dinner, and Janet had tossed away before coffee was served. Now I was so surprised at Miriam's condescension that I flushed, and could only stammer some trite phrase of eagerness to be of service.
"Of course, it's my fault. I'm an unpleasant person, and I don't think always to let people know how much I appreciate them."
She smiled with that warm and persuasive gentleness which informs the smile of a cordial woman, and which I had never seen in Miriam's.
"I have appreciated you very much indeed. I've enjoyed your playing so much. You have such a great love and veneration for music. Not at all like the virtuoso."
"But virtuosi are bored, and when they appear in recital, it's themselves they are thinking of, not the music. I'm not a virtuoso, and I don't play well, but—"
"You play beautifully," Miriam interrupted. "Mr. Pride admires you, too, very much. He is quite fond of you. He was a very sensitive musician himself at one time."
"Indeed. I remember he mentioned playing once or twice. Isn't it a pity to let it out of one's fingers?"
"That, I presume, depends on what one turns in place of it. Mr. Pride is contented in his researches."
We took our coffee into the music room, and Miriam dismissed the little black maid Sally. I watched her closely now, and I found myself doubting what had always seemed so plausible previously when I thought about it, the justice of poor tattered Huff's recriminations. I doubted even that I had ever heard the slick of this woman's whip across Huff's face, or seen the scar it cut. She could be very ingratiating. She was so, at least tonight. I'm glad Mr. Pride likes me. The opportunity I have here to go ahead with my own work is miraculous, of course, and the little work I do for Mr. Pride is interesting. But I rather wish Todd were more friendly."
"Todd's a strange animal. You've seen him with me. You'd hardly believe that he was my dog in the beginning. But he was. He was sent to me from Munich by a friend of mine, when he was only a puppy."
"He worships Mr. Pride, doesn't he?" Narrowly I studied Miriam, thinking of that night in the blizzard, wondering if she too had witnessed any such scene. But not a shadow crossed Miriam's face.
"Do you think so?" she pondered. "Of course he does. It's difficult for me to acknowledge. I'm a creature of jealousy. So does this house worship Mr. Pride, so do these hills. They were all mine once, too. Mr. Pride is a most assuming personality. In no disparaging sense, please understand."
Ah, I reflected. So there is the tragedy. The stronger individual is absorbing the weaker, and the process irks. Shouldn't we say, rather, that they are all yours together? I would think that quite a desirable relationship between 2 people who are in love, husband and wife.
"No, they are just his, but it saves me from boredom. It's a continual challenge to me to contrive something that is mine alone. It amuses me to see how quickly things become Mr. Pride's. My friends, my pets, my books, even my habits. He takes them and scrutinizes them and fits them away in his stacks. I dare say I've done him a great service. Collecting people and things."
She laughed. She feigned to banter, but it seemed to me that she spoke with a repression that convicted her. I laughed too.
"Haven't you ever succeeded? One day I may show you, but tonight, won't you play?"
So I played, but my mind was not on the music, and it must have been a lackadaisical performance. My fingers tapped automatically, my mind contemplated Miriam, and I was thinking, poor silly menaced spirit. Like so many others in this world, you have not the strength for independence, only covetousness for it. You lift your thumb and think it a spire. You cut your toga to fit your shadow, and your feet stumble on it. You can't understand that if you were strong enough for independence, you would have no shadow at all. You would be all light. Only when I was alone in my room that night, I could not help but apprehend that I was wrong about Miriam, that I had not seen clearly through her gesture of amicality to the real purpose directing it. And after that curious, I responded readily to her proffer of friendship, and we were much together. As for Richard Pride, what Miriam had said about his liking me I found amply confirmed in his own demeanor. More than once he seemed veering toward a more intimate discussion of the extraordinary experiments on which he was engaged. His plans obviously were gaining momentum and aim. There was an atmosphere of preparation, of leave-taking and the arrangement of affairs, of chandling and outfitting and overhauling, as if on the eve of departure in the port of his study. Pride himself became inclined to long fits of abstraction, to an idle indifference to what I played, to conversations with me in which often I surmised he laid his hand on the veil of his intention, and all but stripped it back. The white skin at his temples would heave, the long restless fingers that saw for themselves would rove and pry. I would come away from the study chilled, and yet with the fascination growing on me, and my resolution taken to out with my curiosity in the morning. Yet when the morning came, I would be spellbound with gazing, and have no heart to question. My curiosity in Miriam and my curiosity in Richard Pride were fortunate, for now I had no recourse at all in my cantata. Janet was there. I could not forget the press of her palm on the wintered pages. There was routine work to be done, copying and scanning and filling out passages indicated in brief, labor that I held myself to from time to time with fretful painstaking. Then sometimes I would pick up once more the thick notebook of Richard Pride's and seek through it. Chapter 20. I was walking alone with Janet through a summer woods filled with the brightest of birds and the most lush frondage, a tapestry of woods, bleached sunlight and thick leaf and angular rabbit and deer, a millefleur woods of the 14th century. Down a slope we seemed to be going hand in hand, quite silent, and as in a trance, ourselves part of the tapestry woven into it. Then we came to a clearing where the path swerved to the left under one branch of a beech tree on which was nailed a small crucifix of painted wood. Here was a small house of rubble stone with pointed roof and windows, all quite Gothic, the door ajar. I stopped, but Janet loosed her fingers and walked on, with a peculiar and most lovely swinging stride that swung her skirts from her hips, without looking back or calling farewell. I could not speak. Some necessity beckoned me to the little house. Presently, when Janet had gone far into the woods, her hands held back on each side and her face lifted from me, I turned sorrowfully and went to the sagging door. Within was a bare room floored with wide, unpainted boards. Leaves had blown in and drifted across the floor with a dry rustle, and a squirrel in one corner cocked an eye at me, jerked his tail agitatedly, and frisked away, leaving a scatter of nutshells where he had been. On a table stood a platter and mug of heavy pewter and a crust. There was a chair and a bed, ancient and rudely joined, such as I had never seen before. On the window still fluttered a bird of rare and fantastic plumage, green and shimmering gold and red and blue, and on the bed lay a man. Lids so thin they were almost transparent closed his eyes, and his breath was slow and shallow so that I could barely discern the moving of his breast. Naked he lay. He was so emaciated that his gaunt skeleton seemed 5 bones in a sack of puckering skin. Adown his bosom streamed a tangle of gray beard, and sparse gray locks fell back from his cold brow on the straw matting. He was on his back, arms and legs stretched, and leathern thongs knotted on each finger and toe held him to the 4 posts of the bed. Over him a rude netting had been drawn, and I knew that this was to keep the bird from him, for while I looked, it flew over from the window and circled above the smitten figure. Now I understood that this was a hermit, bound thus of his own volition to mortify himself. But it seemed unnatural and evil to me, and I leaned over the pallet and unknotted the thongs and threw back the mesh. The old man opened his eyes and stared at me a moment with his purple eyes, and slowly then he smiled. With my arm under his back, I helped him to sit up, and finally, with great pain and misgiving, he essayed to stand. All this time a most extraordinary sensation was upon me, for it seemed that this forest, without a leaf stirring and yet alive, and all this prescient quietude and frozen ardience of the sun, and the old eremite himself wavering on his feet, and the bright bird that swerved around his head and perched on his shoulder and danced away again, and I myself watching, all this was music, without a sound. It was the prelude to Die Meistersinger, or rather, it was the informing essence out of which the music proceeded. We were the music. We were living it. We were in an actuality of tone, surging themes and opulent polyphony, and crescendos of magnificence. Feebly reaching from bedpost to table to support himself, The hermit made his way to the door, and he looked out for a moment on the lavish woodland, the free skies, and the sweet dreaming paths beneath the trees. But the light hurt his eyes. Wincing, he turned away, and back to his pallet he crept. He seemed to have aged a century above his age before. His strength could carry him no farther. And he lay down once more as he had been, and I, compelled and hushed, knotted once more the thongs on his fingers and toes and pulled the rough net over him. With a wail, the bright bird flew back to the window, and I ran out into the woods and down the gentle declivity after Janet, calling at last, but there was no sign of her anywhere and no answer to my call. Here I awoke from the dream, and on the instant of awaking it seemed the whole moment was presented to me, was in my hands in a few printed sheets. At the top was a name. It seemed to be a French name, and in French it would be spelled Alien, but in my dream it was spelled Alien. Chapter 21. One afternoon, when this new mood of idleness was on him, I told the dream to Richard Pride. Gravely he listened and did not even smile when I laughed. "Yes, to be sure, it may have originated in some story or poem," he assented, "but I can't recall any fiction with just such elements. Wherever it originated, the interesting thing is that it is true. Dreams cannot lie. Consider the name, for instance. A very challenging and yet elusive name. Investigation, if you took pains to look far enough, would disclose unquestionably a real place or a real person who bore it. Historic. Perhaps the spelling is altered, perhaps your pronunciation is wrong. It suggests a corrupt Latin. I've never encountered any name like it, so far as I can remember now, but on the evidence of a dream I would accept it as real." I thought of his speaking of an ancestral memory. "Then your explanation would be that some ancestor of mine went through some such experience." "That would be one way of putting it, but we are too circumscribed by habitual formulas of thought. We identify ourselves by the girth of our belts and the color of our hair, and the craniums that go under our hats. Psychology someday will rid itself of this primitive conception and define a new identity. Not metaphoric and not general, but actual and specific and precise. It will be an identity based on subconscious and not on any physiological constructure in time with a street address. In this sense, I would say that you yourself went through some such experience as this of your dream." It was hard for me not to smile. At least the idea is original, but no experience of the kind can be quite so real as an experience in this present parcel of flesh. "On the contrary, an experience of the kind, historically ancestral, can be just as real as any. You're arguing from the chronological view of reality, or perhaps better, the consequential view. Certainly you will not be indicted for any misdeed already committed and expiated by your great-grandfather. The deed was atoned for 100 years before your birth, and the New York courts on the present calendar will not be bothered with it. If you consider reality, however, from an emotional standpoint, you must admit that an ancestral experience thus recalled in a dream may be real enough to give you a psychic trauma or a symphony." "Yes," I agreed, "but when you consider reality from a mnemonic standpoint, you will admit that all ancestral experience endures and is real in your being today, from its inception to its completion, rounded out and perfect. The generations are in you. The present parcel of flesh, I like your phrase, and the 20 years in which it will serve you are but the meager contribution you may make, this chronological you, to the vast biochemical you, the rainbow individuality which is in the last analysis oneself." All cold, symmetrical, like plate glass, like cut diamond. The long hands crept onward in their endless pursuit, as if now and then they would have got loose from him, broken their tether. The pit sockets under the craggy brows fronted me with uncanny blind vision. "But, Mr. Pride, even if the theory is logically sound, how does it work? To what use can it be put? Who is going to don the rainbow?" "Ah, the utility." Richard Pride cleared his throat. His face lunged toward the window. He meditated a moment. "All of us learn one time to walk. I assure you I've had occasion to try the stilts of this rainbow.
I have been able specifically to become for a limited period a figure of a special interest to me among my forebears. I'm reluctant to tell you the historical dates of his life. I was able to do this, of course, only by concentration of energy quite enormous on the one purpose, a stemming and diverting of vital forces into a particular channel, or as some might say, a fine stretch of the imagination. Imagination. How we misunderstand it! It has come to mean a flight and a refuge from reality. Duristic thinking, Bleuler's called it. And actually it is, and in no poetic sense, a return to the abiding reality. It is affirmation instead of negation. It moves not in the mist, but in the overlight.
Chapter 22. So with some work and much brooding, with existence at Mordaunt's Hall caught up and tense with foreboding, we drew on toward Christmas. Christmas, dies Natalis Invicti, of the sun, God wot, and no Messiah. The time of the Saturnalia was at hand, that 7-day carousal when master and slave sat equal at table, and nothing must be written or said that was not merry. Out of these pagan sources came Tomte Grub and Hans Trapp, St. Nicholas and Bonhomme Noel, Kris Kringle and Santa Claus, I reflected. And here this Christmas I would await them at Mordaunt's Hall, in the midst of my nightmare. What mirth would we have here? The parched skull of Richard Pride in his drifting hands, the sullenness of Miriam, the hysteric audacities of Janet and Del Prado. What a dismal prospect. Last year had not been so dreary, and yet every physical circumstance was so much poorer. I remembered the basement lodging in Chicago's gray north side, threadbare and ingrained with soot, but with a hearth of my own and a few friends around it. And all evening long the coming and going of George, the black janitor, emissary to a Wells Street bootlegger, and the grateful geniality of intoxication, and the songs presently. And then on that crisp night, with the dry snow creaking underfoot, the blithe procession to the cathedral for Mass. One girl came home with me, light of love indeed, neither intelligent nor steadfast in any purpose, idling, going with tides, but very pretty and quite gracious, aware of her sex and holding the gift of it as it was, little animal, her finest contribution and her only utter joy. Such tentative, mild love-making, and better than that, such confidences and small lonely avowals as we lay quietly close together and watched the hearth fire flicker low. And the Christmas before that? With half a smile I took a sheet of paper and jotted down the numbers of the years, 30 of them since my birth, and then for a moment I stared at the page, confounded by its emptiness. Where indeed had I been those Christmases, each one so rich with joy or sorrow, with loneliness intensified 1,000-fold by the careless companioning of other people, by 2s and 4s, couples and whole companies, or with the selfish joy of friendship made infinitely more keen by the spectacle of others alone and dejected. Where had I been? I counted them back from Chicago. I had been in Detroit the year before that. There I had gone to join the faculty of a conservatory, always hoping for that leisure to work out my own dreams, which somehow I never found. And Christmas I had spent alone, seizing the respite of this one day for my own work. But I had been unable to work, I remembered, and eventually I strolled out of doors and roamed the streets until, bitter with loneliness and frustration, I ended in a barroom, getting drunk surlily, chafing with impatience. And the year before that, New York and Margaret. She had light hair, I think the most delicate hair my fingers ever touched, or my breath warmed. And she was a musician, too, with a facility that shamed my slow, arduous toil in creation. So that I was always jealous of her. I think I loved her, but I was jealous of her. I admired her, and she made me conscious of my sluggish wit, and I could accomplish nothing. This night we dined hilariously and planned to separate, and when our plans were resolved, we embraced each other frantically and abjured our cruel plans, protested anew our devotion for all time, knowing in our hearts that we had come, nevertheless, to the end of our way together. She married, I heard since, and has children. Tonight, staring at my schedule of lost years, I felt suddenly very lonely for Margaret, very sad for the loss of what we had, and I sent her good wishes and love from my room beneath the eaves of Mordaunt's Hall. And then preceding that were 3 Noels in Paris, and preceding them 4 in New York. My student years, when all the grandiloquent city was music to me. Oh, that first winter revelation when it became mine, and I could not stay indoors, could never study for joy of it. From end to end I explored it, from the cul-de-sac of Cherry Hill, a pit of turbid night in which deep one lantern sullenly flared, to the Spaniard shops of Chelsea, to Tompkins Square and the gypsy women, Stuyvesant Square and the rolling of chant and organ music from the wide doors of St. George's. And before that, back into my childhood, I pressed my examination of the years, and I myself found, as had Richard Pride, how strangely tenacious memory is of even such precise things as numbers and names. I recalled the street address of a house where we had lived when I was 4 years old, and which I had not seen since. And as I wrote that down, surprised at the recovery, there came to my mind the face and the name of a little girl I had played with, and then, on a moment's notice, thought another name. So I discovered that, as long as I cared to dwell on a point in time, details of place and person would fill in the picture, one after another, and the thing presently would take on depth and stir and voice and color, and I would be almost there again, living my life as I had lived it. Now, what has become of these boys and girls once so familiar to me, puzzling out with me the explanations and significances of life as it manifested itself more and more broadly to our wondering eyes, exchanging confidences, believing and losing faith? They are somewhere, prosperous and contented perhaps, I reflected. They are wondering no longer, or perhaps they are poor and wed to dismay, knowing that something they loved has been lost beyond retrieving forever. Or maybe they are dead, and I remembered the shock when death first came close to me, taking my friend, drowned while swimming on a holiday. Others of my friends are dead, I mused, and the names of them came back to me one by one. But I halted, fairly appalled. For I remembered that when I put down the numbers of the years and looked at the waiting sheet of paper, it had seemed so tragically vain, so impossible to fill in, beyond perhaps the mere listing of places. The dark chamber of Richard Pride. To be sure, this is where he has gone, and whither he is waiting for me to follow. It is the little door into a small closet, but when one enters the closet is found to be enormous. Or is it endless? Where is one to say it ends? This is what Richard Pride means when he speaks of an ancestral memory, going on into the dark chamber now, striding forward through the murk of it. Tirelessly with his little torch, seeking resolutely, he avers he has not yet come to the end. Why then? There may be indeed no end. One can at will step into the shadow and be 1,000 years ago, or 10,000? Where would one be, I marveled, if one had ventured back as far as one could? Then 1,000 mocking voices, poltergeist and douster swivel, mocked me with fantastic answers that I dare not hear. Chapter 23. We were all expectant of something. We were nervous enough to startle at a sound in Mordaunt's hall and curse at a silence, but I think none of us would have been so bold as to try to explain what it was we expected. Certainly we had not expected Richard Pride suddenly to withdraw from the house and take up his residence at the study, alone save for little Sally the maid. It did not touch off the explosive, but it set us wretchedly jangling. She was a lean, slinking, pop-eyed little savage of 14, big for her age, very primitive. Mamie the cook was her mother and a native of the West Indies, full of superstition and voodoo as the West Indian Negroes are. She scattered chase-away powder and mumbled orisons to a great gnarled root. A yellow nasal drone that seemed coiling with equatorial heat was Sally's voice. Her walk and the sinuous movement of her arms were cat-like, and on occasion one detected a musky animal odor about her. She had been as insignificant as any lintel or rod in that household, where one's attention was focused on those other figures of sinister or mysterious purport. Now she became an object of dominant interest, and in a peculiarly morbid way. All one night she wailed, the night before she dropped out of our distrait community and took up her duties over the valley with Pride. I awoke from a comfortable sleep with her lamenting in my ears, and lit a candle and went to the window, where I ascertained the direction of the disturbance. Lights were at other windows, too. The window of Janet's room down the main wing of the house was a pale yellow. Anywhere else, knowing Sally and her kind, I might have smiled and gone back to bed. But at Mordaunt's Hall such an episode depressed one. In the morning it was Mamie who waited on us, solemn and muttering and quite absent-minded, so that Miriam, who was very irritable, rebuked her sharply. Meanwhile a bundle was made of Sally's few necessary things, and before noon off she went following Huff through the woods, snuffling and scared. I did not care to watch the sorry spectacle. I was annoyed with myself for my perverse suspicions, my odd notion that the girl was being taken away for some inexplicable and scientific torture. I saw clearly enough that nothing unusual was indicated by Pride's wish to have a servant with him, and knowing how engrossed he was in his researches, I could not reasonably seek another motive behind his expressed desire for seclusion with them in his study. Yet the doubt persisted. Miriam accosted me on my way upstairs. "Oscar, be generous. Come and play chess with me." She held out her closed fists, and I tapped one indifferently. It held the black pawn. "Let us have a crazy game," she said, distributing her pieces swiftly. "Perhaps thus we will make some notable discovery." And she opened with a preposterous advance of a knight. "Meanwhile, please tell me something silly. I have the megrims." It was difficult for me to respond to her gesture. I played my first piece as blindly as she. "But I have the megrims myself. I've been having bad dreams. Is it always going to rain like this?" "Always, between here and the study. Mr. Pride has retired to his hermitage, and we will see no more of him here for some time." I knew that. I did not mean to be surly. The words slipped from my mouth. "Then you should have told me. Thus you would have been communicative, which is a virtue. Mr. Pride, moreover, is much absorbed in some studies, the nature of which I'm sorry to say I can't explain to you. He prefers always to do his work first, and then, when he is through, let me find out about it as best I can. There goes my bishop." I was not proud of the capture. Miriam too obviously employed the game to keep me with her, and even, I thought, would have flattered me by allowing me to win. "They must be interesting studies, aren't you curious?" "No, neither is Sally, the little slave girl, who is, I am able to inform you, taking up her abode similarly in the study. Mr. Pride now has Todd and Sally. It's almost a menagerie." I played, fuming. Nothing in the world is so unpleasant as to be permitted to win a game. With a man I would have damned. With Miriam there was nothing to do but strive my hardest. Ignoring the impatient tattoo of her fingers on the board, I deliberated each move. I sent my pawns pressing forward with the knights free in front of them, and queen and bishops in close coordination. I ignored those casual openings that her scheme or her carelessness gave me, and that would have disordered my steady invasion. I became aware that every time she moved a piece she would knock over her king's rook. The thing fixed my attention, and exasperated me like the shrill of a whistle. Presently I put her queen in check. She extricated the piece cleverly, and toppled her rook as she drew her hand from the board. Then I stopped. I thrust my hands in my pockets and leaned back in my chair and stared at Miriam full in the eyes. "Why are you doing that? You're letting me win. The implication is at least that I'm so stupid a player you can mock me. Is that what you mean?" Miriam swept the board clean, swept the 30 pieces into her lap, and then began to arrange them anew, the white to me this time, herself defending. "I rather hoped you would swear," she remarked after a moment. "Come, this time I shall beat you, and then I expect you to swear. Something more than profane, something that withers and blights. Then I shall scream, and it will draw blood. Give me a cigarette." There was no quitting for me, and I hardly think I would have abandoned the game now, even had I seen my way to do it. Miriam excited me. Cautiously I opened, and, as I apprehended, Miriam laughed. Reckless, she brought her queen alone out on the board. "That is I. You observe the king shuts himself up in his study. So much for the king. The queen is a wanton, and is something of a Lucretia, moreover. She goes about seducing bishops and slaying knights. Or slaying bishops and seducing knights. She is very informal." "She is at present in very grave danger," I commented, threatening the mad peace with my own prudent lady. "She would rather enjoy being captured. The whirlwind bridled. What a joy there must be in imprisonment, to beat oneself against stone walls!" Her queen was out of my clutch in a moment, guarded, and in her turn menacing me. "She consults with her sorcerers and concocts potions. She weeps for her triumph. What a pity that there is no one in the world who will conquer her, and can. She will never love anybody but her executioner. Do you know any hangman?" Her rant disconcerted me in the swift impulsiveness of her moves, so that I had to force myself again to be calm. and then, becoming silent, she played for 15 minutes such a game of chess as I have never seen. I am far from expert, but clear-sightedness means much in chess. Some of her intentions I could foresee and without much difficulty obstruct. But out would come her queen and rend great paths into my forces. It was I now, with the white, that defended, while her aggressions circled dizzily around me and flanked and harried and crushed me across the board. Her checkmate, with most of my pieces still standing, came like a stroke in sleep. For minutes I could not believe it, and studied the board amazed. It was true, clear, geometrical, perfect. When my bewilderment subsided, I exclaimed in admiration. Miriam's breath came in a gasp. She rested her chin in her palm, and she too examined the field as if fascinated by her own success.
Oscar, the glory is yours. It was a good mate, wasn't it? That compliments one's opponent. You made me do well, and it was quite a brilliant coup. Please play with me often. I'll become some sort of champion, perhaps.
I can't understand even now how you did it. Yes, indeed, it was a most brilliant game. She was putting the heavy, handsome chessmen into their box.
But, Oscar,
she said, her whole manner suddenly changing,
I wish you would do something for me. You may think it absurd of me to ask, and no doubt it is, but I'm worried about Sally. You know I'm responsible for her to some extent.
Why, with Sally's mother here, I should think your responsibility would be very small indeed. And yes, I think it's absurd to worry. What could happen to her?
Nothing, of course, so far as Mr. Pride is concerned. Don't think I distrust him. She pondered. It's more herself, I fear. She's a superstitious little heathen, and that place may get on her nerves. Don't you see? Well, all I want you to do is let me know from time to time how she behaves, how she seems to adapt herself. It's for Mr. Pride's sake as much as for my own, and hers, that I ask this of you. It would be so distressing if anything happened.
I assured Miriam that I would keep her informed, and then I went upstairs at last to my own room and my own thoughts, and the more I considered her request, the more obvious it seemed to me that her purpose was not so simple as she professed. It seemed obvious that she cared not a whit about Sally and all of Sally's tribe, and that it would not have meant more than a moment's vexation whatever gruesome eventuality might come to pass over there at the study. But she intended something far more important to her own enigmatic understanding of things that any slight information I could give her would be. And alone in my room, too, thinking over that episode with Miriam, it occurred to me just how she had managed her brilliant mate. She had moved her queen unfairly from one file to another, and I had been too bemused by the glint of her swift fingers and the extravagance of her apostrophe, and the proximity of her amazing self to perceive the treachery. Chapter 24. 2 rods off the high road I came one day, prowling through fog and mud with my thoughts of Janet, on the small silent ruins of a house, a loose foundation of heavy field stones beneath 2 gigantic spruces, and the mouth of a well gaping at one side. I gazed down over the crumpling coping, and a fathom below the ground level was a surface of brown-green water beneath which the depths of the well were hid. How still it was! I dropped a pebble, and the little plop as it struck the water echoed cavernously from stone to stone. Envenomed the water was, no doubt, that purulent green filled with slow, malevolent thought, memory of tragedy, undercurrent of sighs and terrors and hauntings, tryst and inflamed. Here lies buried the rye stone. It is tended here by maidens with hair gray as Spanish moss and breasts moss green. Preyed upon by my reverie, I turned away from those ruins and set off once more into the clinging fog. I walked an aimless distance that passed a black trunk twisted in grotesque gnarled shapes, and turning with the path I saw Miriam. Only for a moment I saw her. She was very tall and attenuated, and waved slowly back and forth in the fog like a rush in moving water. On her face was a faint, mirthless smile. Her hands were folded on her bosom. Then the apparition dissolved in the mist. Feeling feverish and uneasy, I hurried back to Mordaunt's hall and went to my room. There I threw myself on my bed and tried to sleep, but my heart pounded, my fingers were dry and rubbed together like silk, my lips were parching. When it came time for dinner, I sent word by Huff, who stopped at my door, that I was indisposed. An hour later Miriam came. She entered without knocking and sat on the bed at my side and laid her fingers on my brow.
"Yes, you have a temperature."
She put her candle on the table and with a hand each side of my pillow, leaned above me and looked a long time into my eyes. I wanted to tell her that I discovered her unfairness in our game of chess, but I could not say anything. It was as in a dream, and I could only return her gaze. Her bosom was quite close to mine. Her breath was on my face. Presently she bent still lower, and her mouth pressed against mine. Her hair brushed my brow. She held me thus. When at last she stirred and drew back and arose to her feet, she walked, not treading the floor, noiselessly, and I watched the eclipse of her candle behind my door and went to sleep. But in the morning when I awoke, clear-minded now and quite myself, I could not say whether it was a dream or reality that Miriam paid me a visit. At breakfast, Miriam greeted me with a cool inquiry as to my health. I said I was well. Yes, it had been a dream, I assured myself, born of fever and anxiety and my suspicion of that dark, beautiful woman, the madness and exacerbations of Mordaunt's Hall. Her white teeth would not bite. It was her own life in her lips. I loved Janet, and I was beside myself with anguish at her obscene infatuation for Del Prado, her cruel denial of me. I would tell Miriam about that and beg her to mother my desires. I would point out the smickering of the Spaniard and his unworthiness, and Miriam would help me. So I pondered. But one afternoon I heard Miriam singing somewhere about the house in a queer voice of a reedy oboe timbre. She was singing a song that seemed to have no words and that rose and fell in languid portamento through green chromatic intervals, so that I thought of the Lorelei and again of the underwater and how the sun would come slanting to one that drowns. I went to seek Miriam because her singing had such magic, and I could find her nowhere. And one night I turned the knob of my door and stepped into my room, and stopped in dismay, for it was not my room I had entered but Miriam's. She greeted me with her eyes. With a glance she commanded me, and I pulled the door shut behind me and stood. Surely this was not Mordaunt's Hall, this fantasy in color. Purple were the walls and gold the ceiling, and on the gleaming black floor were rugs of deep scarlet like pools. All around were flowers, enormous white lilies and tiger lilies out of some anthemaniac's hothouse, vocal with vermilions. Over the fireplace hung the Tyrolean saint, stark beard draggling over one swelling breast, and the golden slipper, and the minstrel at the foot of the cross. And a single candle burned at each side of the painting. On the hearth was a fire of black logs. Incense had been sprinkled on them and drifted into the room in swirls of narcotic smoke. On the rug before this fire knelt Miriam, clad in a shift of black silk through which breast and flank were apparent in subtle glow and luminousness, and her fingers wove sinuous patterns like those of Burmese hierophants. Was it an hour I watched? When I awoke again in my own room in the morning, I could not tell. Again, I could not make certain if I had dreamed or really had blundered into that room and watched Miriam do her magic and fallen asleep with drugged odors. End of section 3.